Thanks very much indeed. I have 10 minutes and 10 slides, so I will respond by speaking quickly. Alan Swinburne was entirely correct to say at the start that none of us know what the state of food policy in either the UK or the EU will be in 5 or 10 years' time. Anyone pretending otherwise is just bullshitting. So what we can look at is what has happened in the past and what current trends are now, and that's what I aspire to do. And I want to go back in the first place just to the period prior to the BSE crisis of March 1996. And I'm comparing here these two columns, thank you Tim, UK and EU, back in what I think we can reasonably characterize as the bad old days. Food policy in the UK was in the hands of the Ministry of Ag, Fish and Food, an institution that was fundamentally flawed by the conflict of interest between supposedly protecting consumers and also protecting producers. My take on it is that the BSE crisis, along with many others, demonstrated that it let down all its constituencies and failed comprehensively, and consequently was abolished. Food safety policy in the UK was subject to advice from the Food Advisory Committee and the Committee on Toxicity and others. And those organisations were deeply flawed in several respects, one of which is that they were, to a very substantial extent, populated by individuals who were paid consultants to the companies whose products they were evaluating. There was a wonderful piece in The Guardian back in the 90s by James Ehrlichman when he interviewed a chap called Francis Rowe, who was a member of the Committee on Toxicity, and James Ehrlichman asked Rowe whether he was required to step outside on any occasion when he had a conflict of interest on the topic on the agenda. And he said, I couldn't possibly do that because he said, I'm not beholden to any of the companies because I take money from all of them. And if I was asked to step out of the room, if ever there was a topic on which I had a conflict of interest, I'd remain forever out of the room. Somehow think that was acceptable. And a consequence of this flawed institutional structure was a series of serious failures in food safety policy, salmonella in eggs, which I rather cynically characterise as Edwina Currie lost her job for the only true statement of her ministerial career. And BSE was the culmination of years of failure, and policy making then in the UK was opaque and unaccountable. It wasn't that different I suppose in those days it was the European Community, EC. Food policy was in the hands of the Directorate General of the Internal Market, which was itself there primarily to promote the interests of producers, and occasionally also look after consumers. So it was flawed in the same way that the Min of Ag, Fish and Food was. And the Scientific Committee for Food, the SCF, was similarly flawed as the Food Advisory Committee. And then there was reform. Prior to the supposed completion of the single European market, each member state had its own set of food safety regulations. With the completion of the single market, there was a convergence, but it converged on the lowest common denominator. And the EU didn't handle BSE or dioxin well, so there were similar flaws both at the EU level and at the UK level, and policy was also opaque and unaccountable. And let's jump through that and keep going. Yes, prior to that time, we were always told that policy, oh yes, it was evidence-based policy. It was nothing of the sort. It was policy-based evidence selection. So it was portrayed as if scientific, but essentially policymakers decided what the policy was and then rounded up experts who would give them the advice that they had already decided they wanted to receive. So the first advisory committee on BSE had on it no experts on BSE, in part because they might have drawn attention to the uncertainties as a basis for requesting research funding. No, we wouldn't want any of that. It might reveal something we didn't want to find out. So I think there was a major watershed on the 20th of March, 96, when the Secretaries of State for Health and Agriculture very reluctantly had to stand up in the House of Commons and say, you know, we told you British beef was perfectly safe. Well, it might not have been, but it is now. And the credibility of this system just crumbled. And we've had subsequent institutional reform, both in the UK and at the EU. The Ministry of Ag, Fish and Food was eventually abolished, but not immediately for BSE, but for foot and mouth a few years later. The Food Standards Agency was created, and it was answerable not to the Ministry of Ag, Fish and Food, but the Department of Health. But we now have a situation where, well, the Food Standards Agency is to some extent transparent, but it's entirely unaccountable. I mean, it's transparent. Yes, what's his name? Jack Stilgo at University College draws this distinction, which I think is quite illuminating, between two types of transparency. It's got an open window, so you can see what's going on, but it doesn't have an open door. You can't engage in it. Actually, expert advisory committees are open to members of the public. How many people in this room have ever attended a Food Standards Agency expert advisory committee? 3, 4. So there is a facility, but it's not widely used. So, and non-members of the committee are allowed to speak, but only after the committee has reached all its decisions. So we're only allowed to speak on condition that what we say makes no difference to anything. The Food Standards Agency is supposed to put consumers first, but there are serious questions about that. So there was a similar wave of reforms at the European level following the BSE crisis, of BSE being found in continental member states at the end of the 20th century. It was unfortunate. Actually, the only ministers in the in Europe ever to resign over BSE was a German minister who had the misfortune of asserting that BSE couldn't possibly reach Germany a week before a case was discovered. It was then forced to reply. EU institutions were reformed. Food safety policy was taken away from the Directorate General, which has been and located in what was then the Directorate General for Health and Consumer Protection, now DG Santé, and the European Food Safety Authority was created. The Commission is opaque. Policy-making processes in the Commission take place behind closed doors through unaccountable processes. And the European Food Safety Authority is also unaccountable, but it's interestingly trying to move in the direction of greater transparency. The European Commission, it was true of Sanko and is now Santé, they were, yes, fractured, aimless, and drifting. I used to think that the best we could say about DG Sanko was that they're trying to make sure that food safety standards didn't deteriorate. Now I've concluded that Santé's ambition is to make sure that if food safety standards deteriorate, they do so only slowly and hopefully inconspicuously. To a modest extent, we could characterize food standards agencies as a bit more evidence-based than the Min of Ag, Fish and Food used to be. And it has taken some pro-consumer stances, particularly over traffic light labelling, and then paid the price of having nutrition policy taken away from it by the incoming coalition, because that wasn't what the food industry wanted. So, yeah, let's keep going. Let's cut to the chase. Both institutional systems are working under tight constraints. The Food Standards Agency is supposed to have regard to cost to industry. That was right there in the initial legislation, since subsequently the coalition introduced a rule which is often misrepresented as 1 in, 2 out, which is interpreted as for each regulation you put in, you have to take 2 out. Actually, that's not what the regulation says. The regulation says if you want to introduce a new regulation, you have to abolish other regulations sufficient so that the cost savings are at least twice the amount of the extra costs incurred in the new regulation. And now this government has raised it to, you've got to save them 3 times as much for each of the cost of a new regulation, which ties the hands of the Food Standards Agency. The agency is supposed to be independent. And whenever I hear the word independent, I say, of whom or what, please? Will somebody tell us? I had this wonderful conversation at the European Commission just before the EFSA was created, where I asked the senior official responsible for setting up EFSA how they envisaged the relationship between the Commission and European Food Safety Authority. And the answer I got was, we want it to be independent, but not out of control. And this is the sort of situation we've got. The Food Standards Agency is portrayed as independent, but it is subject to intense ministerial pressure of a covert kind. When the coalition came into power, Lansley, who was then Secretary of State, Department of Health, made it absolutely clear that the Food Standards Agency's job was to keep its mouth shut and its head down. The only publicity it should have is no publicity. The only press coverage it should have is no press coverage. You want silence, no food scares, no food safety scandals. They've had their budget cut, they've had their powers reduced. They took responsibility for labelling away from the Food Standards Agency and gave it to DEFRA, which consequently created a brown trouser job in DEFRA when horse meat scandal broke, because it never occurred to them that it was their responsibility. EFSA is also under intense covert pressure from the Commission, from DG Santé, also supposed to be independent but out of control. The board of the Food Standards Agency, as Professor Lang and I have on occasions shown, yes, when FSA was being set up, we complained to the then ministers that it shouldn't have people from the food industry on the board, and we were told, no, we need the information that they've got, as if they can only give the information from on the board. And don't worry, Tim, don't worry. They'll always be in a minority. They're now in a majority. And the EU, the European Food Safety Authority, is also under tight control. When under the previous President of the Commission, Barroso, competitiveness was the dominant issue, not consumer protection. Now, the European Food Safety Authority is also, we're told, being obliged, its proposals are subject to these negotiations within the European Commission, and DG Santé can't take initiatives on its own. So, we've got a result now where the FSA in the UK has been strong on traffic lights and tried to be strong on sugar, but it's been weak on other issues, food additives, hyperactivity, dreadful on Campylobacter and enforcement, as Jenny Morris was saying. Well, I agree with Jenny. I quote Eisenhower when he was Chief of Staff of the Allied forces at the end of the Second World War. He said, the uninspected deteriorates. And they cut inspections and correspondingly enforcement's deteriorating. The EFSA's curious. It's been quite strong on health claims, but weak on toxicological issues and ecotox issues. And let's cut to the chase in less than minus a minute. The Food Standards Agency is increasingly insecure, it's diminished, it's threatened, it's timid. In Europe, the European Food Safety Authority, well, the chair of the board of EFSA is arguing strongly for increased transparency, but is in effect being opposed by the chief executive, Bernard Orl, who says, well, we'll have transparency except when the scientists make their really serious decisions, and that has to be behind closed doors. He said recently, we want scientists to be able to ask silly questions. I don't mind if they ask silly questions. What worries me is, are they asking serious questions? And unless it's open, we don't even know whether a window or a door, we don't even know whether they're doing that. And so I predict that in the event of a Brexit, the Food Standards Agency will probably become weaker and more isolated, if not actually abolished. In the EU, the European Food Safety Authority is subject to pressure from events, and what will make greatest difference is the unanticipated food scares that people aren't ready for. But having said all that, with minus five seconds to go, I want to make my final point. I think food policy is important. I've devoted the last 40-odd years of my life to it, but I don't think it's the crucial determinant issue when it comes to the referendum on EU membership. I agree. I was shocked to find I agreed with Ian Wright on something. He said, European Union isn't primarily about economics and trade and employment. It's about peace and war. The 70-year period from the end of the Second War to the present day is the longest interval without a land war in Central or Western Europe since 1613. And the primary reason for having a European Union is for peace in Europe. And my view is, if it costs us a couple of grand a year not to have any wars for foreseeable generations, it's a bargain. I rest my case.